gospel is apparently pretty unfamiliar and a difficult one. On the surface, it looks very much like a lesson about the dangers of being rich and the eternal reward for being poor. But that is not the point of this parable, and that explanation is really too simplistic anyway. As I have been saying for the last few weeks, salvation is all about death and resurrection, and about nothing else at all. And this parable is all about death and resurrection, too. Let's first look at the parable itself, which appears only in Luke. Jesus begins the parable without preface or explanation. There was a certain rich man, often called Dives, which is Latin for rich man, who had a very good life indeed. Handmade suits, custom-tailored shirts, a daily menu not a notch below 4-star, and presumably a bankroll big enough to keep the whole operation going indefinitely. But outside the heavily guarded gate of Dives' chateau, there was a certain poor man named Lazarus, not the Lazarus Jesus raised from the dead, who was covered with sores and rummaged in the garbage for food. Jesus says the dogs came and licked his sores. The poor man Lazarus died and was carried by the angels to the bosom of Abraham. And so Dives, finally worn out himself, in spite of his fine clothes and good food, also died and was buried, at which point the scene shifts to the hereafter. From hell, where the accommodations are well below his accustomed standards, Dives sees Abraham and Lazarus enjoying an intimate conversation, and he cries out for Abraham to have pity on him and send Lazarus with a nice cool drink to take the edge off the infernal heat. As is true for most, if not all of us, Dives has learned nothing and forgotten nothing. Send Lazarus indeed. He still thinks of himself as a winner who by divine right can command people like this beggar to fetch him drinks. So Abraham carefully explains to Dives the realities of the situation. Dives had had a whole lifetime's worth of good things, while Lazarus was up to his eyebrows in misery. And, just in case Dives hadn't noticed, things have definitely been reversed. And the rules of the game are such that, far from being able to demand overtime in which to even up the score, Dives isn't even going to be allowed to punt. Between us and you, Abraham tells him, there's a great, unmovable gulf. The game as you knew it is over. Dives, however, never once having taken no for an answer his whole life, never having been at a loss for some way of making a profit out of even the most unpromising situation, falls back on his winner's instincts. Maybe Abraham will give him at least a brownie point if he does a mitzvah. Mitzvah is a Jewish word for worthy deed, and so tries to arrange to have a message delivered to his 5 brothers, warning them about the possible disastrous consequences of their way of life. Abraham, though, is unenthusiastic about this idea. Having Lazarus schlep all over the Middle East delivering messages is just another of Dives' bossy, I'm in control here schemes. Besides, why should Abraham interrupt the resurrection celebration he's having with Lazarus when none of the brothers will listen anyway? Pay attention, Dives, he says. Those brothers of yours already have a whole Bible full of messages. They should get those Bibles out, dust them off, try reading them. But Dives, not so easily defeated, comes up with one last desperate play. If he can't make a commercial brownie point, then maybe he can make a spiritual one. Speaking of resurrection, he says to Abraham, you folks up there are missing out on a good thing. You send Lazarus to my brothers, and I guarantee you'll get results. This would not be your ordinary phone-it-in message. This would be in person from the other side of the grave service. Believe me, says Dives, I know what impresses my brothers. So Abraham takes a deep breath and delivers the punchline of this parable. I'm going to tell you something you obviously don't know, but it is true nonetheless. When we talk resurrection up here, we're not talking about some dumb corpse revival scheme in which the dead get up and go back to the same old life they had before. We're talking about a whole new order that actually works through death, loss, and failure. And in order to give people even a hint of that, the one thing that we don't do is send back revived corpses. The way God has this worked out is that even when Jesus himself gets raised from the dead, he only hangs around for 40 days and then, poof. Because you know what would happen if God left him here? The people never in a million years would get the idea that resurrection was a new order that they could get in touch with only by faith, only by trusting it. Instead, they'd probably figure out it was just one more funny wrinkle in the grimy face of history, and they tried to sell it as something that was merely interesting, like fake news, for crying out loud. If God left the risen Jesus on earth, the people right away would be trying to make a profit off of him. They're pretty dumb, Dives. Dumb, dumb, dumb. Just like you. So, Dives, this is how it stands. Your brothers have Moses and the prophets, and they'll also get the risen and ascended Jesus. That's enough for anybody who's willing to believe and trust. But for people who are hanging around waiting to be convinced empirically, well, listen, Dives, they're out of luck. And there you have it. Death and resurrection stand forth as clearly in this parable as it does in all the others. And the successful life as salvation is just as roundly condemned. Lazarus starts out as a loser, plays his allotted hand, and then in one stunning move, wins the game with the last trump of an accepted death. And Dives starts out as a winner, but because he never accepts death, witness his incessant handling of Abraham and his cooking up of one life-saving deal after another, he loses, hands down. And the ending of the parable of Dives and Lazarus makes this point once and for all. If they will not hear Moses and the prophets, neither will they be persuaded the one rose from the dead. For those who are convinced that living is the instrument of salvation, then death is too much of an unacceptable device to convince them, even with resurrection. From the point of view of those who object to the mysteriousness of the gospel, you see, Jesus' mistake was not his rising in an insufficiently clear way and then sailing off into the clouds. That, if anything, was only a tactical error. No, according to those who will never be convinced that death and resurrection are the only salvation, Jesus' great strategic miscalculation was dying in the first place. After such a grievous capitulation to lastness and lostness, no self-respecting winner could even think of doing business with Jesus. It is not now, of course, that we are to run out and actively seek a miserable life. Contrary to the misreading of this spiritual advice from earlier centuries, we are not to go searching for loathsome disease and rotten breaks. Regular life in this vale of tears will provide more than enough of such things. The truth, rather, is that the crosses that will surely come and the death that will inevitably result from them are, if accepted by us, all we really need. For Jesus came to raise the dead. He did not come to reward the rewardable, or to improve the improvable, or to correct the correctable. Jesus came simply to be the resurrection and the life of those who will take their stand on a death he can use instead of on a life he cannot. And so Lazarus is the Christ figure in this parable. Like Jesus, he lives out of death. For those willing to trust the mysterious working of God already disclosed in the law and the prophets, the mere assertion of Lazarus' triumph like the mere proclamation of Jesus' resurrection, is all the evidence they're going to get. And for those who are unwilling to make a decision to trust such a proposition, nothing will ever be enough to persuade them. But then that was obvious all along. Because like Dives, they will always be in the untenable position of insisting on the proof of something in a universe where it is precisely out of nothing that God brings all things into life and being, at the end as well as at the beginning. So death, you see, is absolutely all of the resurrection we can know now. The rest is faith. Go in peace.